Thank you, Ron. And I want to echo your sentiments as to we have the second of our master lectures today, and I just think what a great set of lectures to complement each other and to really express, I think, two major sentiments in the field and where we're going with our understanding of personality, pathology, and diagnosis. So I'm so glad that we have Dr. Clark here today. It's my pleasure to do her introduction. Dr. Leanna Clark is the University of Notre Dame William J. and Dorothy K. O'Neill Professor of Psychology. She earned a BA and MA degrees from Cornell University and her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Minnesota. In 17 years at the University of Iowa, she served as the Director of Clinical Training and Associate Provost for the faculty. Her research focuses on personality disorder assessment, and she is also the author of the Schedule for Non-Adaptive and Adaptive Personality, known otherwise as the SNAP, which measures personality traits across both the normal and abnormal spectrum. She's the leading proponent of using trait dimensions rather than DSM categories to diagnose personality disorder, and has been serving on the DSM-5 Personality and Personality Disorders Work Group, which has proposed the trait dimensional diagnostic system. She also researches the link between personality and psychopathology and is one of the most highly cited psychologists in the ISI. She has served on a number of editorial boards of multiple journals and is associate editor of the Journal of Abnormal Psychology. Dr. Clark is a fellow of the APA and APS, was president of the Society for a Science of Clinical Psychology, and is currently president of the Society for Research in Psychopathology, and is currently on or been on the executive boards of 3 other professional organizations. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Leanna Clark.
Thanks for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and great to see a large audience after lunch and a beautiful day. So. As my title suggests, I'm going to consider the question of whether the broad higher order domains or lower order facets should be used for diagnosing personality disorder. And I always like to do a check on whether my target audience, the way that I've targeted my talk, is right for the audience. And I want to make sure that everybody is generally familiar with personality disorder characteristics. So I have a little test for you. I'm going to show you some slides, and then I will evaluate from your responses whether I've pitched my talk right or not. So in case you can't read that in the back, have you always been like this, or is it an acquired personality disorder? All right, I've got it about right. We're required as members of the Personality Disorder Work Group to make a disclaimer whenever we talk about the DSM-5 that no structure or content-related decisions have been finalized. The information I will present is not official DSM-5 information, which is available on the DSM-5 website. So the information presented represents my own views of that process. I also want to just begin with a couple of words about why DSM-5 instead of DSM-5. One regards the concern for future editions. A second and more serious reason is that David Kupfer and Daryl Rogier, who the co-chairs of the task force, there we go, got to get my mouth working, are trying to think of or changing the conceptualization of the DSM toward a more living document, and they decided to pick up the software model. So this, with DSM-5, we could have DSM 5.1, 5.2, and so forth. The idea is that rather than overhauling the entire manual every 15 years, if a major breakthrough in the field called for a clear change in a diagnosis, more nimbly could change perhaps one diagnosis on the website rather than having to wait another 15 years to change that. There was also some suggestion that it might be easier to remember, but not so sure. So I suppose you all know the proposal on the table for the DSM-5 personality disorder is that personality traits be used as the PD criteria, and that trait combinations would define personality disorder types. So an initial challenge for our work group was to develop an empirically based trait set, and of course then to validate that proposed structure. It obviously made sense to begin with an empirically based trait structure as the foundation. So we all looked to the well-known 5-factor model. Any ACO, you can probably go through those in the sleep, except those of you who know it as OCEAN as the mnemonics to remember it. At a conference at the end of 2004 leading up to DSM-5, there was widespread agreement on this consensus hierarchical trait structure, which was proposed by Marcon, Kruger, and Watson in 2000, was published in 2005, but the paper was already in print at this meeting, and it was referred to quite a bit. And they looked at these data in two different ways. One as a meta-analysis, which is shown here, and one in a very large data set where they attempted to replicate the structure of the meta-analysis, and it's shown here. Let's go back and contrast those two. The beta weights change a little bit, but clearly the big structure was the same, regardless of whether you use a meta-analysis or a single large data set to analyze the hierarchical structure. Just very quickly, at the top is Digman's 2 alpha-beta, he named them. At the 3-factor level is the Isaacian, Teleganian structure of negative and positive emotionality and disinhibition. Then at the 4-factor level, disinhibition breaks basically into disagreeableness and conscientiousness. And at the 5-factor level, positive emotionality separates out into extroversion and openness. So we have an integrated structure for 3, 4, and 5-factor models. However, there's some problems in implementing a straight, normal 5-factor model in the DSM. It was developed in non-clinical samples, so it has some floor and ceiling effects. At least most of the extant measures do. Might not have the degree of differentiability at the high end of the dimension that's necessary for clinical work. It's also not particularly differentiating for axis 1 or axis 2. That's probably not an issue, but it was one that the work group considered. And there's also some clinical traits that seem to be missing from a 5-factor model. Psychoticism isn't well represented in the normal 5-factor model, and some more specific traits like dependency don't tend to be represented in the 5-factor model. But nevertheless, it was clear that this was our starting point. We omitted openness because there was very little in the literature that suggested that it was directly related with personality pathology. One of the first things that we did was consider the names. Neuroticism has a lot of baggage with it. Almost any term that you use is going to, but negative affectivity seemed to be at least a little more neutral and fairly widely used. We also felt that we needed to focus on the pathological ends of the dimensions as opposed to the non-pathological ends, which tends to be the way that the 5-factor model is put forth and used. So rather than extroversion, we focused on detachment. Rather than agreeableness, on antagonism, and conscientiousness became disinhibition. Initially, we also attempted to create a 6th factor. On this slide, it's still the 5th factor. I'll get to the 6th one in a minute. A compulsivity factor, thinking that perhaps that would be an independent domain from disinhibition rather than the opposite end. But the data said, nope, I'm not going to let you form a new conscientiousness compulsivity factor. Rigid perfectionism in our empirical work leading up to the proposed model came out as rigid perfectionism on the opposite end of the dimension of disinhibition. And then we also felt that we needed to add a psychoticism dimension. Went through a lot of names on this one: eccentricity, oddity, peculiarity, schizotypy. The current version is psychoticism. don't know whether that will survive all the final steps leading up to the manual, but that's what we're using currently. There have been 2 large meta-analyses of the 5-factor model domains and the DSM-4 personality disorders. So as we began to look at how we were going to represent these traits and use them as building blocks for personality disorders in the DSM, we looked first to these meta-analyses. And one was done by Salzman and Page back in the mid-90s, and the second by Doug Samuel and Tom Whittaker, who are here in the audience today. And this is a schematic of those 2 meta-analyses. The key, hello. All right. The key to this, I have on the next slide just to orient you. If their pluses and minuses are in green, it meant that it was salient in both of the meta-analyses. Salient meaning it was a high, clear, strong loading. If it's double pluses or minuses, just signaling whether it's on the high or low end of the dimension, it means it was found in both meta-analyses, but it wasn't a super high correlation, more in the 0.4 type range. And if there's only a single plus or minus, it meant that it was found only in one of the 2 meta-analyses. So if we look back at this, you can see, for example, that neuroticism was a major component of a lot of the DSM-4 PDs when looked at from the point of view of the 5-factor model. And the vast majority, if not all of these studies, use the NEO-PI. So we'll get to that a little bit later. So to look at these in a little bit of detail, one of the things that becomes obvious is that there are some patterns within these data. So for example, paranoid and schizotypal PD, as represented in the DSM-4 by the 5-factor model, are really quite similar. The only difference is the degree of emphasis in the extroversion versus agreeableness domains. Antisocial and borderline PD share low agreeableness and low conscientiousness and are differentiated only by high neuroticism. Schizoid PD and avoidant PD, and to a little bit lesser extent dependent PD, have similar patterns, particularly characterized by neuroticism and low extroversion. And then dependency doesn't have the low extroversion, but has a little bit of low C in it, according to the meta-analyses. Histrionic and narcissistic PD share extroversion, and narcissistic is additionally low in agreeableness. And OC comes out as high conscientiousness in the 5-factor model. So there is, again, the summary of the domains, the meta-analysis of the domains with the DSM-4 PDs. And I'm next going to show you the meta-analysis using a similar schematic to the Facet level meta-analysis that was published by Samuel and Whittaker. You can see a few differences there, and I'll highlight them in a minute. A slightly different key here. The double greens indicate that 5 or 6 out of the 6 facets were salient in the meta-analysis. The white plus minus is for only 3 to 4 of the facets. If it's white and just a single plus or minus, it meant that there were 2 facets and that it was from one of the domains that was found in the domain analysis. If it's yellow, it means that it was just a couple of facets and in a domain that was not in the original domain analyses, and kind of grayed out so it's almost not too visible. It meant one facet went there. So let's look again at the facets, the domains, and here are the only differences between them. So if you look at the squares that are marked, they all have only a single plus or minus. In case of avoidant, it's a plus and a minus. So the difference between the domain and the facet analysis, I would say, is around the edges. It's not concerning the big picture. There's no double pluses that disappear. Occasionally a double plus will go to a single plus. But it's really a matter of filling in some details about the DSM-4 diagnosis rather than changing the big picture. So that's a good thing. Not sure why I have those repeated in there, but I'd now like to walk you through the facet-level meta-analysis to get a little bit of a more concrete feel, instead of just pluses and minuses, for these diagnoses. So the antisocial PD is a combination of antagonism and disinhibition, and if you add the facets in, what you pick up are angry hostility and impulsiveness from the neuroticism domain and excitement seeking from the extroversion domain. Now, those officially in the neo-PIR come from different domains, but angry hostility has a lot in common with antagonism, and impulsiveness a lot in common with disinhibition. So in a way, this really isn't a change again. We're talking about around the edges. And some people would say that excitement seeking is a variant of sensation seeking, which also often is associated with the disinhibition domain. So borderline at the domain level, negative affectivity, antagonism, and disinhibition. If you look at the facet level, what gets added is a few low extroversion components. And I might argue that those are empirical correlates rather than actually part of the definition of borderline PD. For schizoid, the domains are detachment and negative affectivity, and the only addition in the facet level analysis is low trust. Interestingly, in the DSM-5 proposed structure, low trust, which would be suspiciousness, actually is associated with the detachment and negative affectivity domains. So in another sense, there's really no difference in the way these diagnoses are proposed. Avoidant PD is negative affectivity and detachment. And when you look at the facet level, there's some high and low A, low trust, but high modesty, some low competence and self-discipline from C, and one facet of O. It's the only place that O shows up in any of the meta-analyses. So this was sort of support for the decision of the work group not to focus on O in their proposal. And again, you might say that low trust is a part of negative affectivity detachment, and low competence and self-discipline might reflect the low self-esteem that is also associated with negative affectivity. So again, the changes and the differences are around the edges rather than the core of the diagnosis. For narcissistic PD, the domains are antagonism and extroversion. And interestingly, when you go to the facet level analysis, this is one of the very few times when a domain drops out. When you go to the facet level, none of the extroversion facets survive into that meta-analysis. You do get angry hostility added, but again, that fits right in with antagonism. So we saw our challenge, as I said, to develop an empirically based trace set. And as we looked closely, we thought, well, we really should work on developing a lower order trait set. We need to know what comprise these higher order domains. So we generated a facet list based on the DSM-4, based on extant lower order instruments, like my own SNAP and the DAP, and certainly looking at the neo-PIR, and the clinical literature and the expertise among the members of the committee. Then a sub-work group, and some external advisors took these facets, wrote items for them, and derived a facet set empirically through 3 waves of data collection, where data were collected on the facets, the scales were analyzed using IRT analyses to develop homogeneous scales, got rid of some items that weren't working, collapsed some facets that were highly correlated. We started with 37 facets, and by the end of these 3 rounds of data analysis, which are published in Kruger et al. In Press in Psychological Medicine. I'm sure if you wrote to Bob, he'd be happy to send you a copy of the paper. The end result was 25 facets in 5 domains. Some sample facets that survived this 3 rounds of data collection: negative affectivity, anxiousness was one of the facets, with restricted affectivity actually on the opposite end of the domain. Detachment had such facets as withdrawal and anhedonia. Antagonism, such facets as manipulativeness, disinhibition. An example would be irresponsibility. And this is the one, as I said, was another bipolar factor with rigid perfectionism on the opposite end. And the psychoticism dimension had eccentricity as an example of the facets. So using these facets to put together personality disorders, so traits as building blocks of PDs, I'm going to talk about this in two different ways in this talk. And the first way is to focus on the DSM and the currently proposed 6 specific personality disorders. So these are the 6 that are currently in the diagnostic manual proposal. Antisocial, the parentheses dissocial, was added by the task force in an effort to harmonize to some extent with the ICD, which also has this title, dissocial rather than antisocial. Although that group is actually thinking of dropping it as well, so not sure where the name's going to end up. In addition to the 6 specific PDs, the personality disorder trait specified will be available to anybody who wants to use it, in which would be used if an individual doesn't meet well the specific definitions of the 6 proposed specific PDs, but simply has a trait profile that still is worthy of a personality disorder but doesn't fit within any of these. I'm not going to be talking any more about, or not much more about trait specified today, but I do need to mention it because I think it's a pretty important part of the proposal. So after deciding on these particular types, the work group did a rational analysis of the facets, mapping them onto 6 PDs using DSM-4 as a guideline, and synthesized the 5-factor model DSM-4 meta-analyses with those rational analyses to end up with a recommended trait set for the DSM-5 disorders. And here we're going to have another key of the same line. So in the FFM analysis, remember, it was 2 greens if it's salient in both, 2 whites if it's found in both, and 1 white if it's found in only one meta-analysis. And that's the facet level, 5 to 6 facets, 3 to 4 facets, 2 facets with a domain match, 2 facets with a domain mismatch, and 1 facet. And then for the DSM-4 to DSM-5 domains, we're just going to make it really simple on whether there was agreement among a number of us did this rational analysis, and then we came to a consensus. So if we agreed on most of the facets, it's going to be a double plus. If we agreed on fewer of the facets, it's going to be a single plus. So again, just sort of the emphasis. So this is the Neo-PIR domain analysis. This is the Neo-PIR facet analysis. And this is the synthesis that's proposed for DSM-5. Specifically, the 3 domains of negative affectivity, detachment, and psychoticism, and the facets within those of suspiciousness and anxiousness in the negative affectivity domain, restricted affectivity withdrawal in the detachment domain, and all 3 of the facets of the psychoticism domain. So there's the full trait set that's being proposed for schizotypal PD in the DSM-5. Antisocial PD, that's the Neo-PIR domain analysis. That's the Neo-PIR facet analysis. And that's the rational analysis that's proposed by the DSM-5. Rational meaning it's a synthesis of the 2 empirical analyses and the rational analyses. So putting words to this, it's the antagonism and disinhibition domains. The antagonism facets are callousness, manipulativeness, deceitfulness, and hostility, which has a star because it cross-loads over into negative affectivity. And irresponsibility, impulsivity, and risk-taking. Risk-taking starts because it actually has some empirical correlates over into the detachment domain as well. So there are the 7 facets that are being proposed for antisocial PD in the DSM-5. Turning to borderline, the neo-PIR domain analysis, the neo-PIR facet analysis, and the synthesis with the rational analysis. Those are the proposed, that's the schematic for the proposed facets. Negative affectivity, antagonism, and disinhibition. So the negative affectivity facets are emotional lability, separation and security, anxiousness and depressivity, which crosses into detachment. Hostility, which crosses into antagonism, and impulsivity and risk-taking. So these are the proposed facets for the borderline personality disorder in the DSM-5. Narcissistic PD, in the neo-PIR domain analysis, extroversion and low agreeableness. In the DSM facet analysis, it's low neuroticism and low agreeableness. And the work group decided to focus on the agreeableness or antagonism component. So the facets of antagonism that are proposed: grandiosity, callousness, attention-seeking, manipulativeness. For avoidant, the neo-PIR domain analysis focuses on N and E. The facet analysis was more complex. The work group decided to stay with the domain-level analysis and focus on neuroticism and extroversion, or negative affectivity detachment. So those are the domains, and within those domains, withdrawal and intimacy avoidance for the detachment domain, depressivity and anxiousness for the facet level of negative affectivity. So there are the four for avoidant PD. And finally, obsessive compulsive PD, I keep saying that. High conscientiousness in the domain analysis, high conscientiousness in the facet analysis, and the work group also went with what would have been low disinhibition, but throwing in a little bit of negative affectivity. So it's proposing low disinhibition and negative affectivity, specifically the facets of rigid perfectionism and perseveration, which is a negative affectivity facet in the empirical analyses that were done by the work group. So back to the schematic. These are the 6 disorders that are being proposed in DSM-5. And these are the domains, the domain analysis on the DSM-4 PDs. There's the facet analysis. There's the differences between the domain and the facet analysis. So again, around the edges. Trying to get you to think in the terms of the big picture here. Domain analysis, empirically based, and this is what's proposed for DSM-5. So again, in terms of the differences, they're really quite minimal. In terms of just where the pluses and minuses are, there's only a couple of differences. Sometimes, again, it goes from 2 to 1, but other than that, I think I meant to take out that one slide, so making some changes right at the end. So I want to add in here now the other DSM-4 diagnoses. Negative affectivity is what characterizes paranoid personality disorder in the meta-analysis that was done. If you look at the 5-factor model, at the domain analysis, detachment and antagonism are also part of it. Just a rational analysis of histrionic PD in DSM-4 puts it with over there with narcissism because it shares antagonism and has some negative affectivity. The FFM analysis is similar, although it adds extroversion. Schizoid is very much like avoidant, except that it's missing the negative affectivity. The five-factor model analysis actually adds that negative affectivity back in there. Depressivity in the rational analysis is kind of halfway between borderline and avoidant. So the tentative conclusion that one might draw from these initial analyses is that the domain level gives you the broad groupings, the diagnostic categories, as it were, whereas the facet levels might be useful for more within diagnosis, sub-analysis, perhaps individual description or case formulation. So now I want to switch and talk about a second way of thinking about traits as building blocks. I'm going to talk about some empirically based groupings that emerged from a measure designed to assess trait psychopathology, which is my own schedule for non-adaptive and adaptive psychopathology. The sample demographics was almost a little over 8,500 individuals, a little over half female, about 2/3 white, and probably a lot of those not reported. It was just some of the samples they didn't collect race data. They were probably also about 2/3 white, so probably all told about 75% white. It's a largely normal sample, 45% college students, 21% military recruits, about 10% community adults, 25% clinical sample. And we measured in all of these individuals the 15 traits that are relevant to personality disorder in the SNAP. Just going to give you some illustrations of these. Mistrust. That's a sample item from mistrust. Exhibitionism. I love to have my picture taking. That's a sample item from exhibitionism, which is in the positive affectivity domain. And impulsivity. I often act without thinking. Just very briefly, characteristics of the SNAP. They were developed by a combined content and factor analysis, started with the content, then used the factor analysis to refine the scales, has 390 true-false self-report items. The items were originally developed based on the DSM and other personality disorder criteria. It has 6 validity scales, which I'm not going to talk about today, and it also has 10 diagnostic scales that are key to the DSM-4. If you factor analyze the 15 trait scales of the SNAP, you get the 3-factor level of the personality structure hierarchy. So back to the Marcon et al. Analysis, the SNAP essentially emerges at that 3-factor level. The 15 traits coalesce into those 3 factors. Here are the names, just so you get a feel for what's in the SNAP. The negative temperament scale is sort of the core of the negative affectivity factor: mistrust, self-harm, dependency, manipulativeness, aggression, and eccentric perceptions. The positive affectivity scales are positive temperament, exhibitionism, entitlement, and low detachment. Disinhibition versus constraint factor has disinhibition as its core scale, with impulsivity also on that end, and propriety and workaholism on the opposite end of the scale. And what I did was I took these 15 scales in this 3-factor hierarchy, and I correlated them with, I created factor scores for each of the 3 factors, and correlated those factor scores with the DSM-4 PDs. And somewhat to my surprise, yielded 5 distinct patterns. And I'm going to tell you about those patterns now. So the first pattern was a simply high on negative affectivity pattern. And 4 of the DSM-4 personality disorders fell into this pattern: dependent, borderline, paranoid, and schizotypal. So it certainly seemed like it was a negative affectivity pattern with subtypes. So the subtypes I'll come back to. The second pattern was high negative affectivity, low positive affectivity, and avoidant and schizoid PDs fell into this pattern. The third pattern was high negative affectivity, high positive affectivity, and the narcissistic and histrionic personality disorders from DSM-4 fell into this subtype. The next type was high negative affectivity, high disinhibition. Antisocial PD marked this type. And the last was high negative affectivity, low disinhibition, and obsessive compulsive PD marked this type. So let me go back to the subtypes of the high negative affectivity only. Dependency was marked by dependency and negative temperament. Borderline was marked by self-harm and negative temperament, and also had some secondary loadings of low positive emotionality and disinhibition. Paranoid PD was marked by mistrust and aggression. And schizotypal PD was marked by mistrust and eccentric perceptions. So it certainly seems like, got one ahead of myself. It certainly seems like we have 4 different diagnoses here. And there was a little detachment in the schizotypal as well. But if you look at the actual correlations, it no longer appears like these are 4 distinct disorders. Yes, the correlations are a little bit more salient for negative temperament, for example, in borderline independent, but they're also high in paranoid and schizotypal. Mistrust is more salient in paranoid and schizotypal, but still quite present in borderline independent. So it really began to feel like these are simply flavors of the same thing. They really are subtypes as opposed to 4 distinct disorders. Just let you stare at that a minute longer rather than read out all the correlations. About the only disorder there where you don't get that high intercorrelation is dependency, where it really comes out only correlated with dependent. That's the most distinctive of them. So looking at the facet level for the high negative, low positive affectivity disorders, avoidant and schizoid were both characterized by detachment. They were differentiated by their next highest correlate, negative temperament, and low self-esteem. Variations on a theme. Same with narcissistic and histrionic. They were both characterized by manipulativeness, narcissistic additionally by mistrust. Those are the negative affectivity facets. The positive affectivity facets, the only difference was the order of emphasis. So entitlement came out first for narcissism, exhibitionism came out first for histrionic, but otherwise they were the same. For antisocial, one of the things that's important to remember is that disinhibition in the SNAP represents both disinhibition and antagonism if you go to a 4-factor model. So what facets, what scales were represented here? Manipulativeness, aggression, and impulsivity. For obsessive-compulsive, the subcomponents were workaholism and mistrust. So now the fun begins. To compare across the earlier analysis where we were looking very closely at the facets of the Neo 5-factor model and the proposed domains and facets in the DSM-5, and then comparing that to this analysis done with the SNAP. And one of the things that is sort of a rule of thumb for me is if I can replicate a phenomenon across a couple of different types of analyses, so approach the same subject from 2 very different directions and come up with the same answer, that strikes me as a more robust finding than something that you get with only one analysis. So that's what I hope to illustrate today. So I'm going to do some model comparisons. First, the DSM-4 meta-analysis to DSM-5 rational analysis, and secondly, the DSM-4 meta-analysis to the SNAP. And I find that when you want to analyze things that often have a lot of words in them, sometimes it's best to pull back and just do things schematically. So I'm really going to go for color for this. So neuroticism is represented by yellow. extroversion by green on one end, red on the other, using the color spectrum opposites. Antagonism, I decided just to put in gray. And conscientiousness by blue on one end and orange in the other. So this is a schematic of the DSM-4 meta-analyses that I showed you earlier. So neuroticism is most relevant to schizotypal paranoid, borderline dependent, and avoidant schizoid. Extroversion with those same three, plus at the opposite end, relevant to narcissism, histrionic PD. Agreeableness, or in this case, all antagonism, relevant to schizotypy, paranoid, borderline dependent, antisocial, and narcissistic histrionic. And the words that are put in there are to indicate that, for example, the A, even though I've got narcissistic, histrionic put together there, the gray box is really only relevant to narcissism. And for example, under schizoid paranoid, the A box is just particularly low trust. All right, now I'm going to walk you from, this is the DSM-4 analysis, I'm going to walk you from this to the DSM-5 rational analysis. So the first thing I have to do is add psychoticism, because it's not present in the Neo five-factor model. So then I'm going to assume the very specific schizotypal paranoid, for example, and just use the 6 names that are being proposed by the DSM-5. So I've simply changed that top label from borderline dependent to just borderline, for example. Now I'm going to switch the names. Instead of using the Neo names, I'm going to use the DSM names. I haven't changed anything but the names in this slide. I'm going to add one DSM tweak, which is that perseveration appears in negative affectivity in the DSM system. And now I'm going to compare those two. So this was that very first slide I showed you. And that's the last slide I showed you. Let me do that one more time. If you look at the color blocks, absolutely nothing has changed. So now let's do the same thing for the SNAP. I'm going to start with the DSM-4, the Neo meta-analysis, and migrate this into the SNAP analyses that I showed you. Again, one of the first things I have to do is add psychoticism. Now I'm going to use the SNAP labels. I haven't done anything but change the labels. Now I'm going to throw in lots of detail and show you all the SNAP scales that go there. That's the specifics of the SNAP. But in terms of the color blocks, there's the DSM-4 analysis. There's the SNAP analysis. There's the DSM-4 meta-analysis without any of the words, and the SNAP analysis without any of the words. It is the same picture. And there's the DSM-5. So DSM-5, DSM-5, SNAP, DSM-4, it's all the same picture. So I felt like I could make a more firm conclusion that the domain level was very useful for forming broad diagnostic categories, and that the facet level would be useful not for diagnosis per se, but for describing the heterogeneity within diagnosis for case formulation of individuals. So to summarize, a 5-domain model captures the higher order variants of normal range personality, of the DSM-4 PDs, and of the DSM-5 proposed PDs. The 5 pathological personality domains are neuroticism, negative affectivity, detachment versus extroversion, antagonism, disinhibition, compulsivity, psychoticism. So this becomes the model. If you think in terms of major pathological personality patterns, we have a high negative affectivity, low positive affectivity pattern which is avoidant in DSM terms, avoidant, schizotypal, and borderline, as long as you add psychoticism to schizotypal and you add antagonism disinhibition to borderline. Antagonism and disinhibition alone give you antisocial psychopathy. Low disinhibition plus negative affectivity give you obsessive compulsive. And extroversion plus antagonism give you narcissism. So where do we go with this? We clearly need to include bipolarity. The DSM proposal is for, with a few minor exceptions, unipolar scales. And I think that to really model all of personality, we need to have both ends of the spectrum. We need to be able to describe adaptive traits, strengths, emotional stability, extroversion, being friendly and strong, agreeableness, being cooperative, conscientiousness, being dutiful. These traits are not currently represented in the DSM-5, and I think they should be. A lot of my colleagues actually in the DSM work group agree, but we had decided to focus on psychopathology since it is a diagnostic manual of mental disorders. But I think there's very strong sentiment for moving forward with developing a bipolar model that models both the strengths and pathological ends of dimensions. This will also help to characterize certain personality disorders such as narcissistic and histrionic. There are three remaining issues, I think, in terms of clarifying the structure. Are there any facets we need to add? Are there facets that need to be merged because they're too highly correlated? Are there any cross-loadings that we've got wrong? And I think the answer to all three of these questions is yes. There probably are some facets that we're still missing. There are probably some facets that do need to be merged. And there's probably some cleaning up that can be done among the facets. This is clearly DSM 5.0. To conclude, I want to show one more model that merges very well with this sort of domain-focused meta-analysis and synthesis. The first is high negative, low positive affectivity. I skipped a slide. Then extroversion, attention seeking. Then low disinhibition, high negative affectivity. And finally, antagonism, disinhibition. Or perhaps eventually, we will just have personality disorder trait specified, which I think this audience will be able to relate to. Personality disorder trait specified. DSM-5 timetable, is this from the beginning? We're here where that little arrow shows up. A lot of work to do between now and the end of the year when everything goes to the publishers. It's due out in May of 2013. And it will be DSM 5.0. Thank you. I think I have about 5 minutes for questions or comments. Al?
Yeah, Leanna, you were talking about how when you use multiple methods and so on, you're more confident. And David Lickett had written brilliantly about scientific replication and sort of different levels of it, going to what he called the most demanding, constructive replication, where you're specifically using different methods, different measures. And I have contended that the product of the work group at the domain level really constitutes a constructive replication of the personality psychopathology 5 model from 1994.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to get your reaction.
Oh, yeah. I haven't done those analyses yet. We actually have some data that we're looking at. But at least superficially, the synthesis is obvious. I mean, I could give those to an 8-year-old who could read, and they'd be able to match it up. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, that was only half a joke to show the MMPI profile there at the end. I think if that had been a Sci5 profile, I could have worked it into my color scheme. Any other questions? Comments? Yeah, Doug. I'm going to stand up and speak loudly so everybody can hear.
About narcissistic PD and the traits that were assigned. I noticed there were 2 more that have been added since what's on the website.
That might be wishful thinking on my part. As I said, no content decisions have been finalized. I don't want to stand between you and your coffee break, so thank you.